Thank you to everyone that's joined us so far during our webinar series. Welcome back if you've joined us before, and welcome if this is the first time you're joining. Today, in the fourth and final episode of our Data Governance Done Right series, we're going to be discussing how to design a sustainable data governance program. But to begin with, for those of you joining us for the first time, I wanted to share a little bit of info about us. We were established in 2008 with offices in the US and India and 100 plus consultants worldwide. We're also an Informatica Platinum partner with a focus on data governance strategy and implementation consulting, as well as we do have a dedicated team for managed service needs. Today, you're going to be hearing from some of our speakers, Sri and Lokesh. I want to mention if you have any questions to go ahead and put those in the Q&A box of the webinar. We'll be getting to as many as we can live or then following up with you afterwards. So thank you again for joining for the final episode in our series. And I'm going to go ahead and pass it off to Lokesh here to get started. Looks like we're having just a little bit of technical difficulties getting that. So just give us one moment so we can get Lokesh started, and he'll be sharing the information with you.
Thank you, Alex, for the introduction, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody, based on your local time. We are excited to have you on the final episode of our Data Governance Done Right webinar series. Today, we will talk about some of the things to keep in mind that will help our program to sustain. To this point, we have talked about certain aspects of data governance, like how to get started, ingredients for success, and how to measure success. And in this culminating episode, we have tried to bring together all of the concepts that we have discussed so far and summarize it. In case you missed any of the earlier episodes, you can still watch it on demand. You can visit our website or go to our company page or LinkedIn and you can find the details. Last week, I was reading about a competition that happens in a village of England, and it's known as the Tough Guy competition. The origin of this competition is rooted back to the World War days, where the generals of different armies encouraged their soldiers to participate in exercise regimes that will keep them fit and war ready. And they encouraged to involve in war in conditions that would emulate warlike conditions. So things like rope climbing and jumping through water pits. So a former British Army soldier, Billy Wilson, he took this concept and he branded that into a competition or an obstacle race. This is an endurance challenge. And this is something that we do in governance as well. We try to brand our program. And also, similar to the obstacle race, in our journey, we have to overcome certain obstacles that will help us to succeed and help the program to sustain. So what are those different obstacles that we can think of that is a challenge to sustainability? Number one is lack of executive sponsorship. It is important in so many ways that if we don't have executive sponsorship, the program is not likely to sustain. So when there are objections, when there is resistance, having that executive sponsorship helps us to overcome those. Lack of business justification. Whatever work we are doing using maybe technology or in general, if that does not tie back to the business initiatives, if we cannot justify our efforts, the program cannot sustain. Or maybe there is an inherent lacking of data governance itself. We maybe are not doing the right things, and we are things like not focusing on the critical elements, just trying to governance or just try to implement governance across all of the data assets. So we need to have a very crisp understanding of what we are trying to implement in terms of governance. Then we will see resistance from different people to accountability. So who takes up the role of ownership, who takes up the role of stewardship, who's accountable. That is an obstacle as well for sustaining the program. And governance is about culture. We have talked about it, right? It's about how people consume and interact with data. And people are used to doing things a certain way. And then when there is a change, they resist it. They resist the transformation, which is another obstacle to sustaining the program. And then finally, there are competing priorities. With multiple people involved, everybody has their own priority. And then we, as the practitioners, or you, as the initiative leader, you have to have a very catered approach, a thoughtful approach, well planned approach, and prioritize the things as they should be implemented. So, to overcome these obstacles, we can try to come up with a framework, and a framework that is easy to remember and implement. So, sustainability on your fingertips. What can we do about it? Number one is strategy. So, we've in one of the earlier episodes we talked about how planning is important, right? So, strategizing your implementation, the vision, mission, etc. And we'll talk about each of these concepts and details in the subsequent slides. Number two is organization. How do you structure your data governance office, the different committees? How do you go about defining the policies and the different standards and processes? Measuring is important. How do you measure your program and how do you monitor the issues? And finally, how can we leverage technology to facilitate our program or the initiative? So let's talk about strategy. Number one is vision and mission. Couple of times we talked about the data governance charter in our earlier episodes, where we clearly articulate what is the vision of this program and what is the mission of this program. Having an understanding of this and having people on board agree to that vision and mission will help us in the longer run to sustain this program. So things like why we are doing it, the objectives, and what are those goals that we can expect, the outcomes. And it should be the deliverables should be measurable. The goals should be measurable so that we can keep that communication going on. The business understands how our initiative is helping them, and it should be aligned to the overall corporate strategy, the objectives. That alignment is important because we need to have that money flowing because it takes time and effort, people and technology investments to keep the program ongoing. So having that alignment with corporate objective is important as well, and uh, that should be included in our strategy. And then alignment with business strategy is important too, because as we just talked, right? Whatever we do in terms of using the technology, if it is measurable and if we can clearly communicate it back to the business, how it will help them, the program is more likely to sustain because they have a vested interest. Our efforts are making their deliverables easy. And finally, the guiding principles. So we can strategize some principles like in our implementation, we will only go about critical elements and to begin with in a particular business or a subject area. And then all the critical elements will have a data owner, and then there will be accountability. All critical elements will be measured, a trust score will be maintained. So we need to develop a strategy across all of these different metrics. Next is the organization. How do we develop a data governance office, right? So what is the operating model? Is it, are you better off having a centralized operating model where there is uh, one body at the top and it's more of a top down approach? The initiatives trickle down across various departments and then everybody uh, fulfills their responsibility. Or if it is a decentralized model where there are multiple heads across, say, different business functions who are responsible for governing data within their realms, or maybe a hybrid approach, right? So, generally, what we have seen is people take a hybrid approach where top down and bottom up meet somewhere in the middle. Next is escalation management. So, as the data consumers work and handle the data, if there are issues encountered, what is the workflow to initiate to handle that escalation? Who are the people to contact, right? So that there is a clear process defined. Who do I reach out to if there is an issue? The organization itself, what are the different committees, the data governance, relationship managers, the steering committees, the stewardship council, etc., and who are the different members along with their roles and responsibilities. So the SMEs from the SMEs could be like business analysts who act as bridge between the business and IT, and the relationship managers for data governance, who translate those business requirements and implement in the data governance suite. And then who has the oversight of the program, who takes the funding decisions, who sets the course of direction and guides the different participants. And finally, the ownership and accountability. So both on the business as well as the technical side. So who owns the data or the data domain on the business, like customer data or product portfolio data, as well as from the technical side, who is responsible for those IT systems and the data stores where such data resides. Next is policies, processes, and standards. So policies is it's just not about regulatory policies. Policies could be how do you deal with data. So for example, one of the examples we talked last was, as a data analyst, I might write a SQL query which has sensitive data and download it on my local machine. And so in a governance initiative, we can define policies like, okay, this is not permitted, and it should be embedded at the point of access. So having those policies in place, all the regulatory policies, as well as data collection and management policies, the different rules about it, we need to be very clear and implement those if we want the program to sustain. And then what are the different processes and controls? So similar to escalation management, if there is an issue, what is the proper course of action to take corrective measures? Who is responsible to define the quality controls, and who is responsible to implement the frontline workers who are maybe collecting the data or enforcing the quality standards? So we need to have those processes clearly chalked out. And then the data standards and definitions. So reference data management, right? So we want to make sure that the data is consistent, and what is the organization standard for collecting any data for things like date of birth or email, define those standards. And then also, basically the definitions and the standards, we need to define that as well. And the glossary and taxonomy. So the core business concepts around different data domains, again, the customer, product, it could be anything related to the organization, and define a taxonomy around it. So if we have a product, then we have different categories, or if it's a customer, we can have geographic location or buying patterns. So there is a taxonomy to the different business concepts that gives us a holistic view of how business operates in general, right? And this taxonomy doesn't need to be defined clearly right away. It has to evolve over time, but we need to have a structure to it so that it can evolve and can sustain. Next is measurement and monitoring. So on the last episode, we talked about some of the key performance indicators. So for example, after you have implemented your first iteration and you go back to your business folks and ask them that, okay, whatever we have implemented, does that help you solve your challenge? Remember the user story that we talked about, the example of Thirsty Crow. And if they say no, then we need to measure certain KPIs. KPIs like training KPIs and the implementation KPIs. And you can refer to episode 3 for more details on that. So number of business glossaries defined, number of issues that have been registered and resolved. So things like that. It said that, I mean, whatever you cannot measure, you cannot manage. So it's important. The initiatives that we have taken, the efforts that we are implementing, it should be measured so that we can manage the evolution, and then it to make sure that it is in there for long term to sustain. So things like governance scorecard, it could be around quality, it could be around glossaries, the number of governance meetings, and then define qualitative and quantitative metrics that we discussed in the last episode. Governance scorecard helps us to improve continuously, right? At the end of every iteration, we visit that scorecard. And even on an ongoing basis, we continuously visit that scorecard to make sure things are on track, and we need to keep a healthy trend. So analyzing that scorecard helps us to sustain it. And monitoring the issues. Are people involved with our solution? Are they using the solution to open up tickets and also track how promptly are those issues getting resolved? It is a good indicator of people seeing value in our initiative and the efforts. And as more and more people involve, the culture will slowly change, And that is when we can expect our program to sustain. And finally, the technology. Now, technology is only an enabler, right? I mean, a lot of things still need to happen on the process side and on the people side, because it is about culture, and technology is only a facilitator here. So we can use technology for cataloging our different data assets across different data stores and wherever it is. It could be on premise, it could be across public or private clouds, multi clouds, it could be hybrid, right? And various applications. So to draw the end-to-end lineage from source or the inception all the way to the visualization layer, we need to catalog everything. And it also helps us in the crowdsourcing element, what others are saying about the data asset, how the different people, for example, analysts within a community are talking to each other and collaborating. Data quality, we can define our own rules to measure the elements that are critical to our success, right? And then we can assign the quality scores, create dashboards around it, and monitor it. And all of this while we have already defined those roles and responsibilities and accountabilities, who will make sure that the data quality is measured and proper controls are put in place. And the privacy aspect of it, so defining the risk surface, what information is deemed sensitive for that organization, how we can discover and classify that sensitive information. And once we have all of this, we can have data provisioning. So a marketplace like Experience shop for the data that you need for your analysis. Now, Informatica provides industry-leading solutions across all of these different domains. So EDC helps you to catalog all of your data assets, and then Informatica has IDQ solution for your quality needs, DPM, the data privacy management for your privacy needs, and finally Axon governance, where you can bind all of the things together, create your scorecards and dashboards for measuring the progress of your governance, and also gives you the capability to find, understand, and trust the data and request provisioning for that by virtue of marketplace. So this was a quick summary of our discussion that we have had so far, and that brings us to the end of this episode. And before we start taking questions, I want to let you know that we have some exciting events coming up. We will be launching our podcast soon, and on the next webinar series, we will start demonstrating the solutions that we have discussed in this series using Informatica solutions, data catalog, IDQ, DPM, and Axon. Thank you. That's all from my side. And over to you, Shri, for any questions now.
Actually, Lokesh, I'm seeing some questions here, a good amount of questions. I wanted to make sure we answered some of these ones I pulled. The first question here, why is having business and technical owners defined separately important?
Thanks, Alex. Great question, right? It's particularly important because when we talk about governance, we have talked about having representation from both business as well as IT. While the business folks, they define the standards for the data, the expectation out of the data, and they take the overall accountability that things need to be done in a certain way as the data is getting collected, consumed, the privacy aspects of the data, right? So they own it from the business point of view. But when the data is stored across different data stores and different IT systems, right, on-premise and cloud, there is an element of IT to it. So having that IT representation or IT ownership is equally important. This is from a practice level, and when you think about it from technology perspective. So, for example, EDC and Axon, there are certain functionalities that come with technical ownership. So if a particular dashboard is deprecated or if it is encouraged or certified to be used, the crowdsourcing aspect, technical owners are supposed to do that sort of certification, right? And typically a business owner would be a VP, and we don't want a VP to log into such solutions and certify it, right? I mean, they will provide the oversight, but then their technical counterparts are the ones who will unlock these functionalities in the technology solution. So that's the reason we need to have both business as well as technical ownership.
Okay, great. And then another one that I got sent to me, I would love to hear your answer. What is the difference between policies and guiding principles?
Great point again. So policies, on one hand, it's self-explanatory that there are regulatory policies, as well as we talked about on one of the slides, there are policies that are very specific to that organization. So the data collection policy or the data management policy, how the business wants the data to be handled, right? So those are the policies which are more of directive principles versus guiding principles are something that a data governance practitioner or the DGRMs they come up with. So things like out of all of the data assets, maybe it's the first iteration or multiple iterations, but they get to decide what are those critical elements that we need to go after. What is it important, or why is it important for governance? Um, and then once the critical elements are identified, what do we do about it? To things like adding stakeholders accountability and then making sure that the quality standards and controls are enforced. So think of policies as directive principles and guiding principles as principles that guide your implementation around data governance.
Okay, great. And I had another one come through. Will test data management play a role in data governance?
Sure, yes. So there are certain components of TDM like masking. And when we talk about governance, it is beyond discovery. So once you have identified that sensitive data, and suppose there is some sensitive data in your non-production environments, what action can we take on it? Is it possible to mask that data? And we can maybe leverage TDM plugins to mask the underlying sensitive data in your non-production environment. So it definitely has a role to play there.
Okay, great. Well, thanks for answering all those questions, and thanks for those that asked them and joined us today. As Lokesh mentioned, we have other webinars coming up soon in a podcast, so we hope to see you there. And thanks for joining us this series, and have a great rest of the weekend.